The structure rising beside Trevenen Grose's claim in the Deer Lodge Valley looked like a mistake. The cabin itself, a standard 16 by 20-foot box of peeled lodgepole pine, was unremarkable. But it sat on a fortress, a massive, 4-foot-high plinth of gray and rust-colored fieldstone, meticulously dry-stacked, formed a base so broad and tall it made the cabin on top look like a child's toy. The walls of this foundation were 30 inches thick, a bulwark against an unseen enemy. It was the summer of 1869, and in the bustling mining camps of the Montana Territory, men built fast and cheap. Cabins went up in a week, their foundation sills resting directly on the cleared earth. Wood was plentiful, and winter was a problem to be solved with a bigger stove and a sharper axe. But Grose, a quiet man with hands as hard as the granite he worked, spent 6 weeks hauling stone with a borrowed mule before he even laid the first log. Aldous Fenwick, the supply agent for the district and a man who understood balance sheets better than he understood weather, stopped his wagon by the site one afternoon. He gestured with his whip at the monumental stonework. "Grose," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of a creditor. "The bank's note is for a cabin, not a castle keep. That's double the masonry I'd price for a town hall. What in God's name is the purpose?" Trevenen Grose didn't look up from his work. He was fitting a heavy capstone, nudging it into place with a small iron bar, listening for the grating sound that meant a solid fit. He simply said, "The ground is the enemy, Mr. Fenwick." Fenwick laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. He saw wasted labor and a foolish expense that no bank would ever extend a miner's note to cover. To him, and to every other man in the valley who saw it, the structure was an absurdity, a monument to one man's stubbornness. They called it Grose's Folly. Everyone knew stone was cold. It drew the heat from a room, sweating with damp in the winter. But the Cornishman was betting his family's survival on a secret he'd learned deep in the earth, a secret that suggested everyone else was wrong. He was building not against the cold air, but against the frozen continent beneath his feet. We are about to explore the deep physics of thermal mass and how a forgotten principle of ancient masonry allowed one family to live in quiet comfort, while their neighbors fought a losing war against the cold. If you appreciate stories of quiet genius and the triumph of practical wisdom, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We promise you'll learn something new about the world under your feet. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt the stored heat radiating from a sun-warmed rock long after sunset? That simple feeling is the key to this entire story. Trevenen Grose was not a frontiersman. He was not a logger, a trapper, or a farmer. Before Montana, he had never felled a tree larger than his arm or aimed a rifle at anything but a rock for sport. He was a mason, and his world had not been one of wide-open skies and distant mountains, but of darkness, damp, and the immense pressure of the earth. He came from the St. Just mining district in Cornwall, a rugged peninsula of granite jutting into the Atlantic, a land honeycombed with tunnels, chasing veins of tin and copper for 2,000 years. His hands, thick and scarred, were not shaped by an axe handle, but by the sharp edges of Killis and Elvin, by the heft of the spalling hammer and the delicate precision of the tracer chisel. The vocabulary of his youth was not of seasons and crops, but of stopes, adits, and winzes. He understood the world through stone. He knew its weight, its texture, its smell when wet, and most importantly, its memory. He knew that stone, especially dense granite, could hold a grudge, or it could hold a blessing. The knowledge that drove him to build his strange plinth was born hundreds of feet underground. In the deep shafts of the Dalcoath mine, where the air grew thick and warm from the planet's geothermal heart, the biggest problem wasn't just collapse, but water. Cold groundwater would seep through fissures in the rock, chilling the air, making the work miserable and dangerous. The old Cornish solution was a masterpiece of practical physics. The master masons, Grose's father and grandfather among them, would build dry-stacked granite barriers, lining the shafts not with timber that would rot, but with meticulously fitted stone. These walls, called ginging, had to withstand incredible pressure, but they did something else, something almost magical. They learned that a thick, well-built stone wall not only blocked the damp, but it also absorbed the deep, steady warmth from the surrounding rock mass. It acted as a thermal buffer. The geothermal heat would slowly saturate the granite wall, and the wall, in turn, would radiate that gentle, constant warmth back into the working shaft. A properly lined adit was degrees warmer and significantly drier than a raw-cut one. Grose had spent 2 decades of his life working in the quiet, steady heat provided by these underground stone batteries. He had learned in his bones that a great mass of stone wasn't inherently cold. It simply became the temperature of whatever it was connected to. Connect it to damp, cold earth, and it would be a block of ice. Connect it to a source of heat, and it would become a gentle furnace. He brought this knowledge and his young wife Morwenna to the Montana Territory in 1868. The promise was of gold and silver, of working for himself under the sun instead of for wages in the dark. Morwenna, who had grown up in a Cornish stone cottage that was perpetually damp but never truly freezing, trusted his judgment. They arrived too late in the season to build properly, throwing up a hasty cabin just like everyone else's, its log sills resting on stones placed directly on the valley floor. That first winter was a lesson in a kind of cold he had never imagined. The damp chill of Cornwall was a discomfort. The dry, predatory cold of a Montana norther was an active force that sought to kill. The ground beneath their cabin froze into a solid, iron-hard mass. Moisture in the soil expanded with irresistible force, heaving the ground upward. One morning, they awoke to the sharp crack of a floor plank splitting as the frost heave twisted the cabin's frame. Their water pail, set just a few feet from the stove, was skinned with ice by noon and frozen solid by supper. On the worst nights, when the wind howled off the Continental Divide, the pressure differential became so great that the smoke would stop rising. It would pause, then pour back down the chimney, filling the small room with acrid, choking fumes, forcing them to open the door to the lethal cold just to breathe. Trevenen, Morwenna, and their infant son Pasco slept in their coats, huddled together, fighting a battle they were decisively losing. For the first time in his life, Trevenen Grose felt helpless, his skills useless, against an enemy he couldn't see or touch. He realized the cold wasn't just in the air. The true enemy was the ground itself. To understand the genius of Grose's plinth, one must first understand the complete and utter failure of the conventional frontier cabin. The standard design was a thermal catastrophe, a machine perfectly engineered to surrender heat. The primary flaw was its direct connection to the earth. In the Deer Lodge Valley, the frost line, the depth to which the ground freezes solid in winter, was more than 3 feet down. The entire top layer of the continent became a single, solid block of frozen mass at a temperature of, say, 10 degrees Fahrenheit. A typical cabin floor, whether packed earth or rough-sawn planks laid on log sills, sat directly on this frozen surface. This created a fundamental physics problem that no amount of firewood could solve: conduction. The frozen ground acted as an infinite heat sink. Imagine placing a hot cast iron skillet on a block of ice. The skillet will lose its heat rapidly and unstoppably until it reaches the temperature of the ice. The cabin floor was the skillet. The frozen earth was the block of ice. Every precious British thermal unit, or BTU, of heat generated by the wood stove that radiated downward was instantly conducted away into the ground, lost forever. The floorboards were perpetually, achingly cold. The air a foot above the floor might be 30 degrees, while the air near the ceiling was a sweltering 80. This intense temperature stratification made the living space a misery of cold feet and sweaty brows. The second critical failure was frost heave. The soil in the valley was rich with moisture. As this water froze, it expanded with a force of thousands of pounds per square inch. This wasn't a gentle lift. It was a violent, uneven upheaval. It would push up on the cabin's foundation sills, twisting the structure, breaking the chinking seals between the logs, and opening up dozens of new cracks for the wind to knife through. Families spent their winters in a constant state of repair, stuffing rags, moss, and mud into ever-widening gaps, fighting a battle against their own home's self-destruction. The O'Malley family, whose claim was just down the creek from Grose's, burned through 12 cords of wood that first winter. Their cabin was constantly filled with a damp chill, and their windows were opaque, with a quarter-inch of interior frost from November to March. Condensation from their breath and from cooking would freeze on the walls, creating a slick, miserable rime of ice inside their own home. This was the accepted reality. Winter was a siege. The accepted wisdom was to build tighter walls, add more chinking, and cut more firewood. Grose saw the futility of this approach. Fighting the ground was like trying to boil a river. His neighbors were trying to solve the problem with more fire, treating the cabin as a closed system. Grose, with his miner's understanding of the earth, knew the cabin was not a closed system. It was a tiny, warm object in direct contact with a planetary-scale block of cold. The only way to win was not to fight harder, but to change the rules of the game. He had to break contact. He had to decouple his home from the heat-thieving, structure-breaking enemy of the frozen ground. While his neighbors focused on their walls, Grose focused on the floor. He knew that if he could solve the problem of the ground, the rest would be easy. The following spring, as soon as the ground thawed enough to be worked, Trevenen Grose began. He didn't start by felling trees or hewing logs. He started with a shovel, a pick, and a wheelbarrow. He ignored the footprint of his old, failed cabin and staked out a new, larger rectangle. He dug. Not post holes, but a deep, continuous trench, 30 inches wide and 4 feet deep, well below the frost line. This was the work that first drew the curiosity of his neighbors. A foundation trench this substantial was unheard of for a simple log structure. Then came the stone. For weeks, the only sounds from the Grose claim were the clatter of rock being loaded into a borrowed wagon and the rhythmic chink of a mason's hammer. He scoured the valley floor and the surrounding hillsides, gathering thousands of pounds of weathered, rounded fieldstone. He wasn't looking for pretty, square-cut blocks. He was looking for mass. He wanted stones that were dense, heavy, and varied in shape, from the size of a loaf of bread to the size of a small pig. He sorted them by size and shape, creating neat piles that resembled the inventory of a master jeweler, albeit on a gargantuan scale. The build began from the bottom of the trench. He laid the largest, flattest stones as a footing, creating a stable base that would distribute the immense weight to come. Then he began to build upward, course by course. This was not the simple work of stacking rocks. This was the art of dry stacking, a skill that required a three-dimensional imagination and an intimate feel for friction and gravity. There was no mortar. The strength of the wall came from the precise overlapping of the stones and the careful placement of smaller shims or chalks to lock the larger ones in place. Each stone was selected and placed to interlock with its neighbors, creating a solid, monolithic structure held together by its own immense weight. He built 2 parallel walls, an inner and an outer face, and filled the gap between them with smaller stones and rubble, a technique called hearting. This created his 30-inch thick wall. As the plinth rose from the ground, 1 foot, then 2, then 3, its purpose remained a mystery. Aldous Fenwick made his visit during this phase, delivering his economic verdict. "Grose, you've spent more on this wall than O'Malley spent on his entire cabin and woodshed combined. The bank will not see this as an asset. They'll see it as a liability, a folly that can't be dismantled." Grose, his face streaked with dust, wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at Fenwick, then at the wall, then back to Fenwick. "A cabin is a boat, Mr. Fenwick," he said, his Cornish accent thickening the words. "And you don't moor your boat to an iceberg." Fenwick just shook his head and drove away, convinced the man was mad. The plinth continued to rise until it stood a full 4 feet above the surrounding grade. It was a massive, intimidating presence on the landscape, a piece of ancient Cornwall dropped into the Montana wilderness. The final stage of the stonework was the most critical. Grose selected the flattest, most uniform stones for the top course, creating a level surface on which the cabin's floor joists would rest. The construction signature moment came on a late August afternoon. The main structure of the plinth was complete. Grose was setting the last of these capstones. His son Pasco, now old enough to walk, watched from a safe distance as his father guided the heavy, flat rock into its final position with an iron pry bar. There was a low, grinding sound as it settled. Trevenen Grose didn't reach for a spirit level. Instead, he knelt down and laid his calloused, bare hand flat on the stone, then slid it across the surface, feeling for the slightest unevenness. He closed his eyes, his entire body focused on the information coming through his fingertips. He felt a tiny ridge, less than a 16th of an inch. He took a small chisel, and with a few deft taps, flaked off the high spot. He swept the dust away with his hand and checked it again. This time it was perfect. He gave a single, satisfied nod. The fortress was ready. On this immense stone table, he and 2 hired men erected the log cabin in less than 2 weeks. It looked almost comical, a simple wooden hat perched on a giant stone collar. The floorboards, laid directly onto joists resting on the plinth, were 4 feet in the air, completely isolated from the ground. As the first chill of autumn settled into the valley, the other settlers banked snow and dirt against the base of their cabins, trying to seal the drafts. Grose did nothing. He let the wind blow freely under his floor, for he knew the wind was not his enemy. The secret of Trevenen Grose's cabin was not magic, it was physics. Specifically, the physics of thermal mass. The principle is simple. Dense materials can store large amounts of heat energy and release that energy slowly over time. They act like a thermal battery. Think of it in terms of BTUS, or British thermal units, the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. Water itself has a high capacity for storing heat, which is why a large body of water like a lake keeps the surrounding land cooler in summer and warmer in autumn. Stone, particularly dense granite, functions in a similar way. A cubic foot of the granite fieldstone Grose used weighs about 168 pounds. The plinth he constructed contained roughly 1,500 cubic feet of stone, amounting to over 250,000 pounds, or 125 tons of material. It was a man-made geological feature. This massive stone battery was charged every single day, for free by the sun. Even on a clear, cold winter day, the low-angled sun would strike the south and west faces of the 4-foot-high plinth. The dark, weathered stone was an excellent absorber of solar radiation. Throughout the daylight hours, this energy would slowly soak into the stone. It didn't just heat the surface. The warmth would gradually conduct its way deep into the 30-inch thickness of the wall. By sunset, Tens of thousands of BTUs of solar energy were stored within that 125-ton mass. This is where Grose's first innovation, lifting the cabin, became critical. By separating the cabin floor from the ground, he had performed a thermal amputation. He completely cut off conduction to the infinite heat sink of the frozen Earth. His cabin was no longer thermally connected to the planet. It was connected only to his plinth. As night fell and the air temperature plunged to well below zero, the laws of thermodynamics took over. Heat always moves from a warmer area to a colder one. Outside the cabin, the plinth was now warmer than the surrounding air. It began to release its stored energy, radiating it outward in all directions. A great deal of this heat was lost to the night sky, but a significant portion radiated inward and, most importantly, upward. The entire underside of Grose's cabin floor was exposed to the gentle, constant, radiant heat rising from the 125-ton stone mass. The floorboards, instead of being actively cooled by the frozen ground, were being actively, if subtly, warmed from below all night long. The plinth was a slow discharge battery, releasing its stored solar energy through the night, keeping the floor of the cabin from ever dropping to a truly cold temperature. Grose had not created a source of heat. He had built a reservoir to capture the free heat of the sun, and a dam to prevent the ground from stealing it. He had built a system that worked with nature, not against it. That November, winter came to the Deer Lodge Valley not as a gentle transition, but as an invasion. A mass of Arctic air, a continental cold snap, slid down from Canada and settled over the northern Rockies. For 8 consecutive days, the temperature never rose, above 10 below zero. At night, it plunged to 30 below, a dry, crystalline cold so profound it felt like it could crack steel. A relentless wind scoured the valley, driving the cold into every crack and crevice. It was the kind of weather that tested the limits of men and their structures. Inside the mining camps, life ground to a halt. The world shrank to the small circle of warmth around a red-hot stove. In Aldous Fenwick's supply store, men wrapped in blankets sat hunched over the potbelly, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and wood smoke. A few feet away from the stove, a barrel of vinegar had frozen solid. The windows were blind with frost so thick it had formed intricate, fern-like patterns of ice. The only sound from outside was the constant, sharp report of axes splitting frozen wood, a sound that had taken on a desperate, frantic rhythm. At the O'Malley cabin, the fight was being lost. Their frantic chinking had failed against the frost heave, and a bitter draft now poured in from beneath the door. They had hung blankets over the doorway, but the fabric was stiff with frost. They burned through a cord of wood in 4 days, the stove glowing cherry red, yet their children still slept in their coats, their breath pluming in the air of their own home. A mile up the creek, inside the cabin perched on Grose's Folly, the world was different. The silence was the first thing one would notice. The small stove in the corner was fed only a few logs at a time, burning with a low, steady flame. It was not roaring. The air was still. There were no drafts. Trevenen Grose sat at his small table, repairing a piece of harness leather. His wife, Morwenna, sat in her rocking chair, knitting, her fingers moving with easy dexterity. On the floor, young Pasco played with a set of carefully carved wooden blocks, his bare hands resting on the planks. The floorboards were the miracle. They were not warm, not like a hearthstone. To the touch, they felt neutral, like an interior wall in a well-built house. They possessed no chill. This simple absence of cold was a luxury more profound than any roaring fire. It meant the heat from the stove was free to warm the air in the room, not to be instantly sucked away into the ground. The cabin maintained a steady, comfortable temperature of nearly 60 degrees, day and night, with less than a quarter of the firewood their neighbors were burning. On the morning of the 6th day of the freeze, Trevenen needed to grease the hinge on his woodshed door, which had grown stiff with cold. He remembered a small tin of axle grease he had left outside on a flat stone that jutted out from the plinth, a convenient shelf right by the door. He braced himself for the biting cold and stepped outside. The wind hit him like a physical blow. He picked up the tin, expecting the grease to be a solid, waxy puck, as hard as a candle. He would have to take it inside to thaw by the fire. On a whim, he tilted the can. The grease moved. It flowed. It was thick and viscous, like honey in winter, but it poured from the can in a slow, dark ribbon. Trevenen stopped, staring at this quiet impossibility. He looked across the snow-covered flat toward the Finch claim. A pot of grease hung from the axle of their freight wagon, forgotten. He could see it clearly in the sharp morning air. The contents were a pale, useless block of yellow wax. His grease, kept in the gentle aura of the heat-leaking plinth, was still alive. It was a small thing, a trivial observation. But in that moment, Grose knew with absolute certainty that his mad Cornish idea had worked. He had built a small island of temperate climate in the middle of an Arctic sea. The vindication of Grose's folly came not with a grand announcement, but with the sharp, metallic ring of a thrown horseshoe. On the 8th and final day of the Great Freeze, Aldous Fenwick was pushing his supply sled up the valley road. The cold was at its absolute worst, a bitter minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind that cut through his layers of wool and canvas. He was passing the strange cabin on the stone base when his lead horse, a big roan named Jupiter, suddenly faltered, stumbling in the deep snow. Fenwick pulled the team to a halt and swore. The horse had thrown a shoe from its right foreleg. Continuing on was impossible. The horse would be lamed on the frozen, iron-hard road. The nearest shelter was Grose's. Fenwick had no choice. He unhitched the roan and led the limping animal toward the cabin. He sent his boy back to the camp to fetch Silas Croft, the farrier, a man whose hands were gnarled with arthritis, made worse by years of working with hot iron and cold water. Silas arrived an hour later, bundled to his eyes, his tool bag clanking. His breath froze instantly on his scarf. He took one look at the horse and the howling wind. "This is a devil of a place for a shoeing, Mr. Fenwick," he grumbled, his voice muffled. "My hands will be useless in 5 minutes." His greatest fear on a job like this was frostbite. Handling cold steel tools with bare hands in such temperatures was a recipe for lost fingers. They led the horse to the leeward side of Grose's cabin, hoping to get some shelter from the wind. This put them directly beside the massive 30-inch thick stone plinth. Silas set up his small, portable forge, but knew it would offer little comfort. He began the hard work of prying off the remnants of the old shoe. As he worked, his hands, already aching with a deep, familiar pain, began to feel different. He expected the usual progression, from aching to numb to dangerously frozen. But that wasn't happening. The deep ache was subsiding. He realized with a start that he wasn't shivering. Frowning in confusion, he pulled off his heavy deerskin gloves to get a better grip on a nail. The cold air bit at his exposed skin, but it was a surface cold. The deep, penetrating chill that usually crippled his joints was absent. He continued to work, his bare hands moving with surprising agility. He cleaned the hoof, filed it, and selected a new shoe. Fenwick, stamping his own feet to keep the blood moving, watched in disbelief. "Silas, for God's sake, put your gloves on. You'll lose a hand." Silas Croft stopped his work. He held up his right hand, flexing the fingers. They were red with cold, but perfectly functional. "It's the damnedest thing, Mr. Fenwick," he said, his voice filled with a strange awe. He reached out and placed his bare palm flat against the rough surface of the fieldstone plinth. It was not warm. It was cold, but it was a dry, neutral cold, not the life-stealing cold of the air. It was as if the wall itself was pushing back against the frost. "The wall," he said, looking from his hand to the stone. "It's breathing. There's no wind here. My hands haven't felt this good in a winter for 20 years. He finished the job, hammering the new shoe into place with precise, confident strokes, his hands remaining bare for the entire 15 minutes. He had worked without pain, without the fear of frostbite, in the worst cold he could remember. He stood up, rubbing his hands together, not to warm them, but in sheer wonder. He looked at the massive stone base, then at the small cabin on top, and finally at Trevenen Grose, who had come out to watch. He finally understood. The foolish wall wasn't meant to keep the wind out. It was a reservoir. The warmth was already in the stone. Grose had just given it somewhere to go. The story of the bare-handed shoeing in the Great Freeze became a legend in the Deer Lodge Valley. Its messenger was Silas Croft. As the farrier, his work took him to every mining camp, ranch, and freight depot along the mountain roads. While he worked, leaning over a hoof, he would tell the tale. He told it to teamsters in Helena, to prospectors near Butte, and to blacksmiths in Virginia City. He described the feeling of the ache leaving his hands, the strange pocket of calm air beside the stone wall, and the axle grease that poured like molasses at 30 below. Most men dismissed it as a tall tale. But the blacksmiths listened. They, more than anyone, understood the principles of radiant heat and thermal mass. They lived their lives by the forge, a concentrated source of heat, and knew how a heavy anvil could hold its warmth for hours. The idea of a wall that could act like a slow-cooling anvil, radiating stored sunlight, made intuitive sense to them. The following year, when a new smithy was being built for the expanding works at the Anaconda mine, the German blacksmith in charge, a man named Schmidt, shocked the contractor. He tore up the standard plans and drew a thick, 4-foot-high foundation on the new draft. He specified a dry-stacked plinth of local stone, 30 inches thick. The contractor protested the cost. Schmidt, a man not known for his patience, slammed his fist on the table. "I want the Grose Foundation," he declared. "Build it, or I will find a mason who can." The foundation was built, and the next winter, Schmidt's smithy was the only one on the mountain where the water in the quenching tubs didn't freeze solid overnight. The idea began to spread, not as a residential novelty, but as a mark of quality for industrial buildings, where a stable, dry, and moderately warm floor was a commercial advantage. What Trevenen Grose had built through intuition and ancestral knowledge, modern building science would later codify with formal names and precise calculations. His sun-warmed plinth was a rudimentary form of a passive solar design known as a trombe wall. His elevation of the structure to decouple it from the earth is the fundamental principle behind modern insulated slab-on-grade foundations and frost-protected shallow foundations. Grose was practicing a sophisticated form of thermal engineering a full century before it would become a mainstream concept. He had no equations, no computer models, no understanding of BTUS or R values. He had only the memory of his hands on Cornish granite and a deep, tactile understanding of how the earth behaves. He saw the problem not as a battle for warmth, but as a question of energy flow. The lesson of the stone plinth was more profound than simple survival. The settlers in the valley saw winter as an invading force to be fought with the brute force of fire. They believed warmth was a thing you created, a product of consumption. The more wood you burned, the warmer you would be. Their entire strategy was based on generating more and more heat to throw at the unending cold. Trevenen Grose operated from a completely different philosophy, one learned in the deep, quiet dark of the earth. He knew that warmth wasn't just something to be made, it was something to be gathered, stored, and directed. The sun bathed the valley in a torrent of energy every single day, even the coldest ones. The warmth was already there, free and abundant. The problem wasn't a lack of heat. It was a failure of storage. While his neighbors were trying to build a better furnace, Grose was building a better battery. He understood that the ground didn't create cold. It stole warmth. He saw that the sun didn't just provide light. It provided energy. His creation was not an act of defiance against nature, but an act of deep listening. He built a dam for a river of warmth that flowed invisibly around everyone, a quiet lesson from the heart of the ancient stone, proving that the most powerful solutions often come not from fighting the elements, but from simply giving them a better place to go. If this story of ingenuity taught you something valuable, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing for more tales of forgotten wisdom. And as always, a final thought for our viewers. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the techniques and principles are based on real historical practices. Should you consider applying any of these methods today, please consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.